My name is Ben Novak. I am the lead scientist of Revive and Restore, the world's only nonprofit promoting the innovation and adoption of biotechnologies and conservation. For Revive and Restore, I work on a number of projects I lead the project to recreate the extinct passenger pigeon and recreate the extinct heath hen through modern bioengineering and paleogenomics. I work on recovering genetic diversity for the endangered black-footed ferret and Przewalski's horse through our conservation cloning programs. And I help oversee a wide array of conservation genomics projects. And just this year in 2022, I launched an entire program dedicated to innovating biotechnology for bird conservation, in which I am managing science teams all over the world in Japan, Korea, Germany, and the US that hopefully I as intended, will revolutionize bird science, not just for conservation, but as an entire science. So I will be working to genetically engineer pigeons over the next 2 years. This is as an individual private endeavor. This is separate from my day work. The reason I do not consider myself a bioengineer per se is that I personally do not have the computational biology skills. I actually lack computational skills entirely. And I don't have the genetic skills to really understand how to put together a gene construct for a transgene or how to design a gene edit. Those are things that I rely on having a collaborator to help do. Where I've specialized myself in the work that I want to do is in the organismal side of things, of the animals that we want to engineer. So I want to engineer pigeons. So my expertise is in breeding and handling pigeons and how to manipulate their eggs and ensure that a transgenic animal gets from birth to adulthood and that type of thing. So, it'd be very different if we were talking about engineering yeast or engineering bacteria. I'm in the field of wanting to engineer things that are multicellular organisms, and that's pretty different. That's in my hobby, and in my day job. What I've been doing for the last 10 years is trying to find the real bioengineers out there that could do things that could make a difference in wildlife conservation and oversee and program manage where that goes. So I've been in a seat of what is the big vision for bioengineering in the world, while not always having to personally be the person in the lab figuring out how to do it. The world of biohacking is certainly opening up the possibility that many more people can get into bioengineering. And in truth, if you're working at a laboratory that's engineering organisms, it's going to be pretty rare that you are a person who does every step of the work from point A to point B. We rely on collaborative teams. And so I think, I'm happy to call myself a bioengineer in the fact that I've specialized myself. I know the field conceptually. I've figured out where I can put my skills and expertise. And the end goal of both my private laboratory work and my work for Revive and Restore is ultimately engineered organisms. So yeah, I'll take the tag then. Yeah, so I've been working for 10 years for a nonprofit organization called Revive and Restore. We're the only nonprofit organization in the world with the sole mission to promote and foster the innovation and adoption of biotechnologies for conservation. So we consider all forms of biotechnology, from simple genomic sequencing and bioinformatics data to augment conservation decisions already happening now, to the realm that more people would consider bioengineering, where we're actually manipulating an organism or an aspect of its ecosystem. And I actually fell in love with the idea of biotechnology when I was about 13 years old. I wanted to get into conservation and do things to save biodiversity since I was probably 11, 12 years old, when I really became aware of the problems facing biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. And I became aware of recently extinct species, which fascinated me. The idea of restoring ecosystems was very fascinating to me. I grew up near a national park, Theodore Roosevelt National Park, where species had been restored. The bison, bighorn sheep, and elk populations that are in Theodore Roosevelt National Park were all transplanted there. They had gone extinct due to extirpation in the 1800s and early 1900s. And decades later, conservationists grabbed some from the Rocky Mountains and northern Canada and other areas and brought them in. And I thought, well, why can't we do that for something like a dodo bird or a woolly mammoth or a passenger pigeon, which is my personal favorite, the one I'm working on. And it was just happened to be about the same time in life that the human genome was being published, and people were talking about genetic engineering a lot. Like with the sequencing of the human genome, the whole concept of where we go from there was really a hot topic in science and media. And my brain made the click. It was like, well, maybe if we can sequence DNA from an extinct species and we can engineer that DNA back into a living form, we can do a level of restoration that's just not open right now and not possible to us. And my education, I actually went down the road of ecology and evolution. I did a lot of paleontology study and some work because I thought, okay, if I'm going to restore extinct species, then I need to understand extinction and extinct species. I think there's a lot of different ways someone could get into the work that I do, through zoology and from a conservation genetics angle, from more land management angles, or from computational biology, genetics, genomics, and even programs now that are really focused on bacterial genetics and do genetic engineering early on. Like, you can get into it from a lot of different levels, because the concept of applying biotech in conservation requires all those players, people who understand the environment, who understand the organismal biology and the population biology, people who understand animal husbandry and how to breed these species, animals who understand embryology and how you manipulate these things in development, to people who understand the genes and the genomics. And where I've gone with my job is basically understanding kind of the big picture of what all that is, so that hopefully I can continue to orchestrate programs that do all these things to help endangered species and the extinct ones. I am of the philosophy that we do not need entire generations to go to university and put the time and commitment into 4 years of school, sometimes 5 or 6, due to complications that are out of our hands as students, to earn a degree for something that we could have gotten into straight out of high school through hands-on work. There may be some options to get into things like zoology and animal husbandry without degrees, but in truth, in the conservation realm and the biotechnology conservation realm right now, it's probably extremely difficult to get into it without doing at least a bachelor's degree study. Actually, even for state agency and federal agency wildlife groups, wildlife agencies like Fish and Wildlife Service, it's recommended to at least get a master's or go higher in education, simply because, for one, the job turnover is much slower than it used to be. So prolonging your start date is just helpful. But second, there are also not a lot of entry positions where you can start getting that experience on the job like people used to. And third, if you're going to think about using biotechnology, even if you're not someone who's actively doing the biotech side of things, you really should understand it. And it's difficult to come in and understand if you don't at least have a very good background in genetics and genomics, and things like, if you're going to work with wild species, things like conservation genetics and population ecology. These are things that, you know, require a lot of education to understand. It's very difficult to just go in without at least a couple of years of enhanced biology and math. So yeah, so I think for anyone to get into the work that I'm doing with biotech and conservation, I highly recommend university degrees in at least one of the subfields that would lead into this. And no matter what subfield you go into, if it's strictly zoology or if it's just broader biology, you know, you definitely need to be getting in some coursework that is intro to genetics, intro to bioengineering, things like that. With bioengineering and where biotech is at, it just gives me this sense that you can imagine almost anything now. There's a lot we don't know about how genetics work, which genes are responsible for what traits, but you know, the concept really is at a point where you can say, okay, well, maybe we'll engineer a population to be disease resistant. Maybe we'll engineer it to overcome climate change. You know, just the fact that I think one of the most powerful things we can even think about right now is the fact that not even creating an extinct species, which is, you know, what I'm most excited about, but the fact that the concept that I can take a specimen out of a museum drawer and take a tiny bit of tissue and sequence its genome and then compare that to its living relatives of, and let's take, for instance, a species I work with, the black-footed ferret. In 1985 to 87, this species went down to a total of 18 surviving animals, of which there were families and related animals to the point that of the ones that saved the species and bred in conservation breeding centers, only 7 were considered actually genetically distinct in some way. So all living black-footed ferrets trace their ancestry to just 7 individuals. And we could now consider opening up museum drawers of animals from populations that are completely gone and wiped out, sequence their genomes, compare it to all the living black-footed ferrets and go, okay, what's some genetic diversity that this species is missing, and edit that back into a living population and make it as if, you know, a little bit of genetics survived more. You know, the fact that we can reverse kind of these once completely irreversible traumas to nature is what's really cool to me, because we could do that for lots of species. And then when you think about, well, can we create a gene construct now that makes them self-vaccinating to overcome the diseases that we've introduced, which is work that Bridget Baumgartner of Revive and Restore is overseeing, and I help support her in that. You know, there's just a lot of things we can think about doing. The fact that Island Conservation and the G-Bird program are coming up with ways to potentially humanely eliminate invasive species using things like gene drives or other gene suppressing elements to allow it, you know, to remove the idea of using toxic pesticides. These just open up so many doors to change the way we live with nature. And we could engineer livestock to not transmit disease to other species. We can engineer plants to grow larger on less water, less food. And, you know, so we could be enabling for the first time in history a future in which, rather than alienating other species and creating quality of life for humans off of the degradation of this planet, we can create a modern, even more futuristic idea of human quality of life that is in coexistence and harmony with the other billion species on this planet. And not only can we do that, but if we can push forward and recreate the legacy of extinct species, like recreate something that is a new passenger pigeon and put it in the wild, then we're looking at a future in which for the first time there might be a generation born in which there's finally more in the world than less in it. And because that's what hits me when I was born and I learned about things like the dodo bird and the thylacine and the passenger pigeon and the great auk, was that I was born into a world that had less life and diversity in it than the generation before me. And that's been every generation of human beings for basically the last 125,000 years that we've been spreading across the planet and altering the planet in ways that have caused the extinction of incredible species that we once lived with. We once lived with woolly mammoths and painted them in cave art. We don't have that anymore. People once lived with passenger pigeons just 2 human lifetimes ago. And that's something that through carelessness and avarice has been robbed from the present day generations. And my sons, who were born just 30 years, oh my goodness, my sons were born just 32 years after me, were already born into a world that had hundreds, if not thousands of species less than when I was born. And the sad reality is when I become a grandfather, my son's children will be in a world that has less in it. And someday, because of bioengineering, we can change that and start putting more back into the world. That's what keeps me having faith in that there's a better future for humanity. The most important thing that's beyond bioengineering for me in the work that I do to try and restore nature with bioengineering is that we seldom appreciate the human connection to it. We live in a world where something like 70 to 90% of people, depending on where you live, are urban now, and our urban environments are very disconnected from natural settings. And they don't have to be. We can build cities better to where they're not. We can invite species in, but it is the state we're in that we have people that have grown up their entire lives with literally no exposure to other species around them. And that's actually very alien for human beings. For 300,000 years, the condition of being human is tied within an environment that is co-inhabited with thousands of other species that we built our culture off of. You think of every indigenous tribe in the world, they are connected to the species they live with. That's where their stories come from. That's where their culture comes from. And all of us have that indigenous origin. As a white person from European descent, you go back several thousand years, and our people are shamanistic, druids, Celts wandering across the nation who tattoo designs of animals on their skin, wear animal hide, and work it into their art and their stories. And it's something we've slowly drifted away from, but it is still in us. If there's any case for there being kind of genetic memories, the human condition is one that needs nature and green space. And there's now a whole lot of empirical research to show us that hearing the sounds of the ocean for an hour helps relieve stress. Walking in a park or a nature setting for an hour or 2 hours decompresses the physiological stress of the human body. We have empirical biological evidence now that we need biodiversity just to be happy human beings. And bioengineering literally is the key towards the future that has everything we've come to love about our modern life and still allows other species to live in it. And what's really awesome to me is just the fact that this grand vision of entire species coexisting with human beings better than ever before can start with cells in a petri dish, tissue in a microcentrifuge tube, gene sequences as digital information on a computer, and it can be an email chain between me and someone in the United Kingdom or Kenya or New Zealand exchanging ideas. I mean, there's just so much cool stuff to this field. I could talk about it forever. Well, so I'm quite lucky through my work with Revive and Restore that one of our roles as an organization is to connect people and convene meetings that bring biotechnologists with conservationists together. And there are people in almost every country of the world that are thinking of what bioengineering could do for them, either in biomedicine, agriculture, and more are thinking about what it can do for nature. Because one of the cool intersections right now for bioengineering and conservation and biomedicine is the fact that human health involves the environment. One of the hottest things in a lot of people's minds is malaria, and how many people it kills every year from mosquitoes. And could we engineer mosquitoes to stop transmitting malaria to people? Or engineer mosquitoes simply to eliminate the 3 species that transmit the disease and leave all the other mosquito species and insects that pollinate flowers and do things in nature. And by thinking of how do we help human health, knowing that the problem comes from another species has forced people in biotech and medicine to think of the environment and the ecosystem. And so there's this direct intersection that then people start thinking, well, if we're talking about engineering mosquitoes to help humans, well, mosquitoes are transmitting malaria in Hawaii to native birds. We could do this to save birds. We could do this to, save our poultry and then move on to other wild birds and quail in Africa, right? So people are seeing that it's no longer distinct anymore between nature and human. It's really interconnecting, and it flares up a lot of opinions about anti-GMO sentiments. What right do we have to alter people or other species? But at the heart of it is this concept that there is technology now that forces us to have these questions that can be used for incredible changes in the world that are good. But how do we ensure that we actually do those things, not just for good intentions, but with responsible process so that the outcomes are as intended? And yes, it's really cool. You can get into this just through the network of people thinking about it from ethics and policy. And, I guess we're looking at a future in which people could consider themselves bioengineers who work in politics and never once step into a laboratory. There are things that bioengineering could do that could be imaginably bad. What I worry most about actually is not so much the bad things that could happen, but a system that enables bad players. And so right now, almost everyone working in this field that I know, well, everyone that I know, and I would assume almost everyone, wants to bioengineer the world for good reasons, but not everyone has the same understanding of ecosystems and human societies that can make sure that the idea that they're driving forward actually does deliver a good consequence, right? So I worry a little bit on the regulation side, but I also worry very much, most often, that policies and regulations will put a barrier between the concepts and ideas of bioengineering and their real world applications. This is a field where some people get so worried about what could happen that they want to even stop research. And research contained in a laboratory is safe, it's well regulated. There's not only federal laws, but also institutional regulations that are quite oftentimes almost overburdensome. Excuse me. Yeah, it can be quite overburdensome to a researcher. Sometimes they don't make a whole lot of sense. You can imagine, like, when you get on an airplane and you think, well, why can't I have a nail clipper? This is a little overboard, but the world of bioengineering is similar at a research level, where people are concerned is, I've created something amazing in the laboratory, now I want to use it in the environment. That jump is bigger, and we have a lot in place there as well to move forward. But a lot of people, they're wanting to stop research before it starts. And we're not going to learn, we're not going to discover, we're not going to make a better world without research. So I'm actually most concerned about the process being cut off than I am about people actually doing potentially bad things with bioengineering. But the one thing that I can say kind of potentially validates the concerns over bioengineering is the reality that we live in a world with huge, huge economic inequality. And the reason I bring this up is that there are people concerned about biohackers, whether or not people doing private lab work for fun or to create their own patented products will unleash a super virus or do something horrible. And the problem with thinking through that is it actually takes a lot of money to be a bioengineer. It doesn't take a lot of money to set up a laboratory that can do DNA extractions and PCRs, to where you could maybe order a transgene and put it into bacteria or yeast. That doesn't cost a lot of money. But to be able to create an organism that functions and lives requires education. Education is expensive. Understanding what you're doing is expensive. Even if it only costs a few $1,000s to set up your own private lab to do bacterial research, that is still a pretty large investment for most people living in the United States and most people in the world. And if you want to, say, create a genetically engineered mouse, the microscope you will need just to manipulate an embryo costs $150,000. There's a huge barrier economically to being a bioengineer that is capable of doing something that actually has potentially large impact to the rest of the globe. That's why almost all of this research that's having real significant change for medicine, agriculture, or nature is occurring at universities where there has already been millions of dollars in grant money to set up laboratories, to establish the infrastructure to do this, where people have 10 to 20 to 30 years of career experience building this field. Those are the people that will make a difference, not the biohackers. But maybe in 40 to 50 years, biohacking will be something where someone comes up with a cure for a disease in their little lab space. But I guarantee for the next 50 to 100 years, those people are still going to be what we would consider rather gentrified, rather privileged. And so, no matter how much we try to make it cheaper to engineer complex organisms, it still takes a lot of money to get into it. And what concerns me about that is if we don't change society and our economic structure, what we're doing is we are enabling the extremely rich to potentially build their own biolabs and do whatever they want above the radar of the regulations where that public institutions and even many commercial institutions have to adhere to, that no other normal person or regular income person can do. And then it becomes something that it doesn't matter if the public speaks out or whatnot, is that no one can really have a strong voice against the world's billionaires. As an advocate for my job and my organization, Revive and Restore, I really should say I really hope that bioengineering solves, some major nature problems, and I do. But actually, personally, I'm really hoping that bioengineering gives us as human beings medical breakthroughs that finally allow us to maybe live in a little less fear of things like cancer, that allows what I would really love to see is a world where no one has to suffer the symptoms of genetic disorders anymore, or die from genetic disorders. So I want to see a world where people born with Tay-Sachs disease don't die from that disease, and live a normal, healthy life, that people born with muscular dystrophy can be Olympic medal winning athletes, that people born with certain types of genetic blindness open up their eyes for the first time and see because they've been cured before it happens. And that's a world where CRISPR and gene editing technologies actually can get us there, and there are already human trials doing that. And so what I want is for those cures, literal cures to problems that could have never been cured without bioengineering before, to be available and free to everyone. I want a world in which we come up with ways where we can have a higher quality of life the longer we live. I want people in their 90s to feel like they are 30 years old, and have people that don't degrade as they age just because it's the biological condition. I don't necessarily think we need to be people that live a lot longer, but I think we don't really know the limits of the human brain or the human body, simply because we haven't really optimized aging. We eat better now, we have more food security now in many places, so we're living longer, but we haven't figured out the right medical attention to live longer in a good quality way. So, I want to overcome that. And then when it comes to nature, as I've kind of already said it, I really want, if I were to say there's one thing I want to see in the next 10 to 20 years, it's a genetically engineered organism in the environment, a whole population of them restoring an ecosystem, doing what they were naturally evolved to do, but what they got compromised from doing due to human activities. I want to see resilience in nature. And of course, personally, I want one of those species to be a recreated passenger pigeon. So I guess we didn't really cover this, but I should just say to everyone that one of parts of my job for Revive and Restore is a project to recreate the extinct passenger pigeon, among many other projects to use biotech with nature. The reason the passenger pigeon is really my favorite species, and I'm so passionate about it, is I learned about them when I was about 13 to 14 years old. And if you read the accounts of the passenger pigeon, they were once the most abundant bird on the planet. A single flock of passenger pigeons could have been 2 to 3 billion birds in size. And they flocked so densely that when they flew overhead, people said it was as if there was a solar eclipse. I mean, they blotted out the sun and it was dark. They created their own wind. They were a force of nature that's really difficult to imagine today, because there's nothing of similar abundance and size today. And really, nature used to be like that everywhere. Maybe not billions, but here in North America, before the arrival of Europeans, there were nearly 100 million human beings living alongside 5 billion passenger pigeons, 50 million bison, 500 million prairie dogs, I think maybe 500 million geese, over 1 billion total different species, numbers of different species of ducks. This is a continent with life everywhere. It's what you read in the accounts, that these settlers come in and they're like, oh my gosh, today we saw this, and that's not what we have anymore. And I believe just that bioabundance is captivating and fascinating. And it begs the question of, why can't we have that today? What is it about that would scare people today? Like, how are we so distant from this power of nature that we're scared of these things that we really should be in awe about? I've always been in awe. I was born and raised in a rural natural setting, and I want to see huge herds of buffalo. I want to see huge flocks of birds. And so it's just its history captivates me. And the more I research the bird and the more I've learned about it, the more we've come to understand in the field that this species is actually vital to the forest ecology of the eastern United States. This was a species that was flocking in billions of birds, anywhere from maybe 50,000 years to 1 million years ago, shaping the evolution of species that we think, wait a second, a pigeon or a bird couldn't do that, right? That the evolution of oak trees themselves, giant oak trees, is shaped by pigeons. is kind of phenomenal and mind-blowing. But it's true that we have trees and plants and other species whose evolution for hundreds of thousands of years was shaped by these pigeons, and that are in a state today of trouble because they need the types of things those pigeons did in the environment, the disturbances and the nutrient transport and the things that they were doing. We need that back. And so, yeah, so it's just anyone that wants to look up the story of these birds, there's a lot of kind of folklore out there, but I've got some talks online about our research and other stuff like that, that you can get kind of the lowdown on what passenger pigeons were. They're an elegant and beautiful bird. They're not the street bird that you often think of when it comes to a pigeon. And for me, passenger pigeons, I hope for other people too, would be kind of a gateway animal into realizing there's actually a lot of diversity to pigeons in the world. Victoria crown pigeons that are the size of a small turkey that are blue with blood red eyes, and fruit doves that have pink heads and lime green bodies, to desert living pigeons with black faces and long tails. There's 350 species of pigeons and doves in the world on every island and continent outside of the Arctic realm. They don't like the cold. And there's a whole lot there. And then if you look at regular pigeons that inspired Charles Darwin's work, go to a pigeon show and see fancy pigeons, and you can see what human beings have been able to do through selective breeding. There's 350 different species of pigeon in the world, but there are nearly 700 different breeds of just one species, the rock pigeon, some of them are so different. It's that back in Charles Darwin's day, people actually thought that they didn't know, they'd forgotten the history of how the domestic pigeon was domesticated. So there were different breeds of domestic pigeon that people actually thought were different genuses of bird because they were so different, but they're the same animal. There's a lot. There's just cool stuff.